Hello, I'm Hinda Shalou. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing with Business Wire, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the News Release Benchmark for Technology Industry webinar. Last year, we partnered with Onclusive to take a look at trends in press releases related to earned media, syndicated articles, and social media. We reported those results in a white paper and also on a webinar. And later last year, we updated the report to move towards industries, and we did a webinar on healthcare and bio. And now we're looking at the technology industry. So just a couple of housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded. You are muted, but if you have some questions, please put them in the Q&A section. We welcome any and all of your questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can throughout the webinar and at the end of the webinar. Now, please help me welcome our panelists. Sean O'Neill, the President of Onclusive, Brian Moslep, Strategic Director, SVP and Director of Strategic Intelligence with Methods and Mastery. Some of you might have noticed that we had Diana Gold on the webinar originally. Unfortunately, she was unable to make it today. However, Methods and Mastery is Google's agency, and so Brian will be well able to talk about some of the Google things that Diana was going to chat about. So if I can ask Sean and Brian to just spend a minute introducing themselves, and then we'll get on with the webinar.
Thanks,
So,
Hinda.
Sean?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, Sean O'Neill here. As Hinda mentioned, I'm the president at Onclusive. If you are not yet familiar with Onclusive, we are the data science company for communications. Our whole business is to connect communications and PR content to business outcomes for the first time. We use natural language processing and artificial intelligence to reveal which PR strategies are driving actual business impact through proprietary technologies like PR attribution, which we invented to, for the first time, connect PR and communications content to things like consumer behavior and sales. We're a Bay Area headquartered company, and of course a technology company ourselves. So I'm one part here is representing the data and the analysis, and also one part here representing the technology PR practitioner. So very excited for today's discussion.
Thank you, Sean. And Brian?
Thanks, Hinda. Yeah, my name is Brian Moslep. I'm a Senior Vice President and Director of Strategic Intelligence at Methods and Mastery. I've been leading global analytics teams at agencies for the past 6 or 7 years. Started my career as a scientist and engineer, kind of made my way into science writing and technology writing, where I wrote for publications like Wired, The New Yorker, Scientific American. Then I kind of made a turn and really started looking at how we could analyze both social media and news media and draw meaningful insights from that to help companies really make decisions about how they communicate. So that's what I've been doing. So it's great to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to this panel.
Well, thank you, and we're glad to have both of you here. So, let's start off with sort of the question, which is, what makes technology PR different, if anything? So, Sean, you've been doing technology PR for a really long time. What's your insight about that?
Yeah, so I'd say it's been interesting as we've moved from the sort of broader cross-industry benchmark analysis, the first one that we did towards these industry analyses. As you mentioned, the first being the healthcare and biotech, and now this technology analysis. It has really been interesting to see that the data reveal some pretty material differences in the strategies that technology companies use to both distribute their news, as well as a lot of the behaviors from both consumers as well as social media and the journalists in terms of how they consume and engage with that news. And I think we're going to highlight a number of those differences today.
Yeah, well, why don't we start looking at the data? So Just so that everybody knows, we gave Onclusive anonymized press releases from July until December. And then Onclusive compared the mass of press releases and pulled out the technology releases from that grouping. And this is the data that's based on that technology. And so Sean's going to talk about both technology, but he'll do some comparisons to the general releases. So let's talk about release timing for PR releases.
Sure. Yeah, this is I think the right foundation to start the conversation. And so what we see here, these are the most popular days and times to issue your technology news release on Business Wire. So this is not necessarily speaking to what was the most effective. This is literally just the most popular clusters of days and times. And you'll see when you go all the way over to the index to the right-hand column that the most popular times to issue technology PR releases. This is PR releases instead of investor releases, to be clear. We're going to talk about IR releases here in a moment. But as it relates to general PR releases, the most popular times are 7 and 8 a.m. Eastern. And then you see a smaller spike later in the day around 3 o'clock. And then, you sort of see a relatively, I'd say, even distribution throughout most of the other sort of general working hours, but, a pretty strong cluster here around 7, 8 a.m. When we compared that to the cross-industry analysis, which was, 17,000 news releases across dozens of industries, what was interesting is we actually saw a very similar clustering, right? 7 and 8 a.m. were still the strongest times, most popular times, followed by 3 p.m. Now there's a little bit more of a distribution, on a couple hours earlier. So you saw a little bit more at 5 or 6 a.m. or, 9 or 10 a.m. with some of the other industries. But it was remarkable to me to see how consistent actually the behavior is in terms of the most popular times to issue the news was.
So let's take a look at IR now.
Yep, so timing of the IR releases, I would say sort of generally speaking also fairly consistent with what we saw around cross industry, right? You see sort of 6 and 7 a.m. very popular to issue your investor relations and regulatory news, right? Trying to get ahead of the markets. And then very consistently, you saw again another big spike at 3 and 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern, which is, coming up to and around the closing bell, right? Because of course, the nature of these releases is very different from general PR releases. Most of these are required regulatory releases that are specifically designed to influence the markets. So yeah, very consistent, I would say, first thing in the morning and then right as the markets are closing. What was interesting, though, is that the most popular days to issue technology IR releases are Wednesdays and Thursdays, which was actually much more narrow than what we saw across industry. We actually saw very little variance across the individual days of the week when you bundled in the cross-industry releases. So you actually see a little bit more, I would say, nuanced specific day timing with technology. For some reason, Wednesdays and Thursdays seem to be the slightly more popular days of the week.
So let's take a break for a minute from looking at the data and just talk about a little bit about the nuances about technology PR across the country. Sean, you started your career on the East Coast, you came to the West Coast, you've gone back to the East Coast. Talk about your sort of experience in what you've seen across the country.
It's a great question and interesting. Yeah, I've basically been operating, different technology businesses bi-coastally for the last 15 years, having resided in San Francisco and New York, back and forth during that time. And just in the last 12 months, I've actually, moved from the Bay Area back to New York. It's fascinating to just be a part of that sort of both technology community as well as the media community The Bay Area, I guess it's a bit of a, bit of a stereotype, but, it's somewhat insulated. It's true, right? We sort of, Bay Area companies and the media that cover them, reporters in the Bay Area specifically, there is a little bit of a bubble, right? It's a huge economy. There's just an incredible energy. There's an incredible, concentration of talent and innovation happening there. And so, one of the things that, I think a lot of technology companies sort of fall prey to is being a little bit overly technical in their communications, right? Like you read a lot of news releases from technology companies, and you see a lot of jargon, you see a lot of acronyms, you see just a lot of talk about the technology, what it does and how it works, and maybe not quite as much about the simple benefits and who's using it. And that seems to actually resonate a little bit more specifically in the Bay Area, right? If I brief a reporter who works for a tech publication, and he or she's in the Bay Area, they seem to sort of go along with that a little bit more. And having come back to New York just in the last 6 months, I've been reminded again, same publication, but an East Coast journalist, not quite as interested or impressed with all of my technology jargon. And I've been reminded that really, we have to be very simple in the concepts and the language that we use, because it's not really that interesting for most folks to hear about the guts of your technology. What they mostly want to know is what's the value and who's using it, and frankly, what do your customers have to say about it? And so I think generally speaking, myself and my company, included, we have to be very mindful of, simplicity and not being overly technical and using too much jargon. And especially when you're sort of branching out of the Bay Area, you have to be extra careful of that. That's been my experience personally.
Which leads us to talking about earned media, right? Because this is what everybody wants. They want the journalists to write about it. So let's see what the data says.
Yeah. So right, this is sort of the gold, right? This is the output that everyone is ultimately striving for. Is how much earned media did your news actually garner for yourself? And what's interesting here is definitely some pretty clear patterns. You see, between, and let me just step back just to make sure this is clear. We're now no longer looking at the most popular days and times to issue your Business Wire news release. What we're looking at here is the most effective days and times to issue your news release. Okay, so the first was literally just what were the most popular times, and now we're looking at the rate of releases divided by the number of earned media articles. Okay, so it's the truest sense of most effective day and time, not most popular. And you see immediately, the first obvious takeaway is that the most popular days and times to put your news out are not necessarily the most effective. And in this case, you actually see a very different set of information for this. So, the most popular times were 7 and 8 a.m. But the most effective times are between 3 and 5, right? By far, right? No other sort of window actually even, comes close to this. There's a couple anomalies in this. If you sort of, glance around, you'll see Tuesdays at 1 a.m. were strong performers, and also Tuesdays at 10 p.m. But other than that, very clear cluster. When I compared this to the cross-industry analysis, we saw technology times were much more pronounced. This cluster is much more pronounced and a much more clear pattern. When you looked at it cross-industry, if you recall, you saw 5 and 6 a.m. was a good time, 3 p.m., 7 p.m., 9 p.m. We even saw 11 p.m. showing efficacy. But it's very clear here, right? Between 3 to 5 p.m., with Thursdays being the best performing day, followed by Friday, right? You see a little bit on Tuesdays and Tuesdays as well, but very, very clear and I'd say relatively narrow optimal days and times for issuing your news in order to get earned media coverage.
So Brian, you were an ex-journalist, you work for an agency, you've been looking at this stuff for a really long time. What do you think? Why are these clusters showing up as being particularly effective?
Yeah, I think, looking at that block, again, from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern, that's noon to 2 p.m. on the West Coast. And kind of building off of what Sean said, with tech press being primarily located on the West Coast, just thinking about that daily cycle of what a reporter might, what their day might look like. My experience in the newsroom was reporters get an early start on the West Coast. They're already 3 hours behind what's going on the East Coast. So, they usually come in and they have that first story that, they probably either had in mind the previous night or something that they read early in the morning, and they're building that first story and just focusing on getting that out. So really what this is suggesting is like maybe around noon to 2, like that's when they come up for air, right? And like think about what's the next story they're going to write. And I think that kind of aligns with the trend that we're seeing here in the data, and could possibly, it's at least one hypothesis of why that time is so effective in terms of getting coverage for your press releases.
So Sean, we had a question from the audience asking about geographic disbursement. And I know you did look a little bit at geography, but was there anything that stood out with regard to geographic effect on timing?
Yep, good question, and obviously highly relevant to Dr. Mossek's hypothesis here. We did get a fully representative sample, I would say, of geographies, meaning this was 6,000 plus news releases across Business Wire's entire technology sector. So it was, I would say, highly representative of the geographies. We did then, of course, more casually observe, some of the clusters geographically, where we saw a lot on the West Coast, right? Not just Bay Area, but Seattle region. Utah was fairly popular. And then we saw actually a lot in sort of that Texas region, Dallas and Austin, as well as, of course, greater New York. So it was very consistent with what I would say is just the general geographic distribution of technology companies.
But what about outside of the US? Was there any visibility that you have that you can share outside of the US?
Nothing that really jumped out from that perspective. I think what Dr. Moslep is onto here is actually probably a very astute observation, which is, yes, you've got a lot of the tech journalists on the East Coast, excuse me, on the West Coast. And yes, they're generally, that whole community, probably trying to get a jump on the media overall. And I think a lot of folks are actually time zone adjusting. When we looked at, and we'll talk a little bit later about like best times for social media engagement, when we look at some of the other metrics around, how news is being engaged with, we see a lot of really, really early morning engagement and a lot of really, really late night engagement. So we'll talk a little bit more about how I think just generally, a lot of the comms teams and journalists are trying to time zone adjust.
Okay. Well, let's look a little bit more about the data and talk about follow-on articles. First of all, Sean, can you take a minute and define for the audience what a follow-on article is, just in case there's
So this is related to the previous slide. A follow-on article is just another term we use to describe an earned media article, right? So you put your news out on Business Wire, and then some third-party editorial coverage occurs, right, related to that news release. So we call it earned media. Sometimes we call it a follow-on article, and you'll see those two terms actually used on this particular this particular chart. So this is a different dimension to what we saw earlier. The previous slide were the most effective days and times to issue your news to garner that follow-on or earned media coverage. What this is looking at is actually the more of the distribution or the averages. In this case, actually the mode would be the thing I would call out for earned media. So this would be, hey, when I put out my news release, what should I expect to get on average in terms of number of earned media articles? And here we actually put a side-by-side comparison of technology news releases versus all industry or cross industry. And you can see here the data is highly similar when comparing technology against the cross industry. The rate of follow-on articles is actually very much in line with the cross-industry average, and I would say just indicating strong appetite overall from journalists to cover technology news, right? Not a ton more or less in terms of appetite. You'll also see the curve here, just at a glance is nearly identical. And we see the exact same mode of 10 earned media articles being the most common number of earned media articles for both sets, right? So 10 is the mode, meaning it's the most common occurrence here across both data sets. What's interesting though, and this is where it starts to look a little bit different, is the technology releases, there's what I would call a longer tail, right? So you see 180, 190, 200, you see those data points plotted on technology where they don't quite show up on cross industry. Now, it's not to say that, there aren't some blocks of releases that are getting, 100, 190, 200 earned media articles across industry. There are, but it's not statistically significant when you look at that larger sample. And the main takeaway here is that the longer tail really indicates that more technology releases received some earned media engagement than the cross-industry release on average. So everything else looks identical. The mode is the same. The overall curve is the same. But you actually see that some technology releases are actually receiving more earned media than what you'd expect in other industries.
So I'm just going to answer a question that came in about some definitional stuff. So when we say earned media means that a journalist or someone specifically wrote something about that related to the press release. It is not syndicated. Syndicated is something else, and we're actually not going to talk about syndicated today, but this is literally follow-on earned media, or stories that were written as a result of the release. So with that being said, Brian, I want to focus on you, specifically, you've had a lot of experience with Google and other large companies, and large companies generally get a lot of press, but there are a number of people who are on this webinar who don't work for, the Googles, the Microsofts, and the IBMs of the world. What do you think that they can do to help garner earned media?
Yeah, it's a great question. Kind of being on the agency side, that's kind of what we do, right? Everybody thinks that agencies are representing big global brands, and we do a lot of that for sure, but we also do a lot of work with startups and small companies. They often come to us because they want us to help develop their voice, right? And it's a different approach, I think, to PR than when you're working with a startup versus a large global brand. Because if you think about the appetite of the news, of reporters, they're often just waiting for these big companies to make announcements, right? They're kind of just preparing themselves for that. And to a certain extent, it's a much easier transition to getting a piece of earned media or a piece of coverage, right? An article written about your brand. With startups, they're used to being scrappy, and when they're creating products, they have to be scrappy in their communications as well. And when we kind of help them develop their voice, the press release itself has to be very precise and targeted. You have to give the reporter enough information to know that this is significant, because they're not just waiting for that information, right? It's very, very different than these large organizations that are constantly making news. Smaller companies have to make their own news, and they have to make people care about it. And that's the power of communications. That's the power of what we do as an industry.
Thank you. Sean, there were a couple of questions regarding the distribution of the news releases that we gave you. Somebody was asking about whether they were from large companies, small companies. I believe the distribution was fairly even across all the way in terms of large, medium, small. Would you agree with that?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, again, 6,000 plus Business Wire news releases, and we observed it to be highly representative of the technology industry overall, meaning both types of technology companies as well as size and scale.
And again, Sean, there just seems to be a couple of questions regarding syndicated news versus earned media, slice follow-on. Can you give Onclusive's definition? Onclusive has a very good definition that defines both. So can you help with that?
Yeah, and I probably could have done a better job with defining earned media, what it is as well as what it isn't. And as you said earlier, Hinda, so we do have the concept of a syndicate or a syndicated article. That is a specific type of article that we measure and analyze. That's distinct from what we call an earned media article or a follow-on article. A syndicated article or a syndicate is like literally an exact replicant of the press release. And so you put your news out on Business Wire. Of course, you're hoping for earned media, which is when a journalist writes a story about the news and it's new and unique editorial. It's related to the press release, but it's authored by an independent journalist. The syndicate or the syndicated article is an exact replicant of the news release itself. That is then picked up by sometimes dozens or hundreds of websites that have real estate on their website to basically republish exact replicants of that news release. The most, I'd say, popular ones, and we all see them all the time, like Yahoo has tons of syndicated news on their properties. Bloomberg has tons of syndicated news. A journalist isn't going in and then writing their own story, and that wouldn't be a syndicate, right? There isn't someone actually editing or creating some new variant of the news. It's an exact replicate. Now, there is huge benefit to those syndicated articles because it actually takes that news release and takes it outside of the context of Business Wire's direct network, where they're literally delivering the news to the inbox of thousands of reporters, and actually puts it out into the digital media ecosystem to then be discovered by many, many more, both journalists as well as consumers and the target audience of the company. So not to say that there's not great value there. There is. We haven't pulled any data around syndicated articles here. We've only focused today's discussion around the earned article, that follow-on article, and we're also going to be talking about social media engagement as well.
So Brian, I want to go back to you for a minute because of the comment that you made that small companies or startups sort of have to make their own news. Can you give, I can think of negative examples, which I don't want to talk about, but can you talk about small companies, startups who have been successful making their own news as outside of syndication? Can you, I think of some obvious examples, right? When, Uber started up and Lyft started up, and, again, I can think of Theranos, which would be a negative example. But what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of the work that we do for startups is confidential, so I can't give you like exact case studies, so to speak, of successful brands, but I can tell you about the approach that we take. For a startup, it's really important to understand the landscape of coverage. How does the overall, what does it look like? What is the coverage around your industry, the problem you're trying to solve? What does that look like? And then what we do as an agency is kind of help them figure out what's the blank space. What is the area where people are not talking about this particular technology? How can we insert ourselves into that conversation in a meaningful way, in a unique way? And I think that's the common thread here when you're talking about startup communications, is making people care about what you're doing. Startups, they have these amazing technologies, but often have trouble kind of communicating how that is impactful to the general public. And that's where the agencies come in to help them, right? To kind of take them from a product value proposition and create a communications value proposition, the core story that you're trying to tell. So, I said before that startup communications are much more precise, and that's because we use these things like landscape analysis to really figure out how they can create meaningful conversation in the space and not just be shouting into the hurricane. So I think like that's the fundamental aspect of that. Yeah, without giving examples, I think that's the methodology that startups should follow.
Good, thank you.
Shouting into the hurricane.
Yeah, that's good.
I really like that.
Well, speaking of shouting into the hurricane, let's talk about social media engagement and what the data said about social media. So, Sean.
Yeah, so that's of course sort of in addition to having journalists pick up your news and editorialize it, hopefully with positive sentiment. The other major outcome that the modern communicator is seeking today, of course, is to have their news engaged with on social media, right? I think it's an important metric because it's a proxy to reader engagement, right? When you see social media, likes, shares, comments, retweets, et cetera. First of all, it's a signal that your news is even being read, which is important. Beyond that, of course, social media engagement amplifies the news, right? It takes it beyond that sort of organic placement on a media publisher's website or platform, and then the social media engagement actually augments it. It creates additional shared earned media. So this is the second and second most important metric here for I think a lot of communicators. So when we look at basically the tweets per release on average, and this is for PR releases. The first thing was actually this curve looks very similar to the number of tweets per release for technology releases versus that all industries combined analysis. Very similar curve. Although it was very interesting to see here that we saw a significantly higher average number of tweets for all industries combined, right? 56.8 was the average number of tweets across all industries, compared to technology, which had only 22.6 tweets per release. And I just scratched my head. It was very counterintuitive. I would have expected the exact opposite relationship, right? You're thinking, well, technology news must get more traction on technology platforms like Twitter, right? Social media is where the technology media lives and breathes, right? So I was really surprised to see that lower average amount of social media engagement for tech releases. That said, I think it can be partially explained by the fact that the distribution of technology news engagement, similar to the way that we saw the distribution of earned media articles, it moves much further to the right of the x-axis. So you see it stretches well past 100, goes to 125, 150, even 175 tweets per release for some technology releases, which is significant social media engagement, right? Think about that. You put your news out on Business Wire and you're getting 150, 175 engagements on that one piece of news, on Twitter. And so this longer tail to us indicates, again, similar to what we saw with earned media, that more technology releases received some Twitter engagement than the cross-industry releases on average, right? Lower tweets per average, but more releases overall actually did get some Twitter engagement than we saw across other industries.
Well, it's possible, that the Twitter engagement, that the lower Twitter engagement on technology may have to do with just consumer versus not, right? That technology companies may not have the same type of relationship that other companies have. And that may be the reason for the change. In as much as many technology companies are incredibly well-known brands, it simply could be that engagement and passion is not necessarily there. I know that our next slide is about timing, but Brian, I want to open it up and talk a little bit about social media. I want to talk on two ways for social media, which is, the data somewhat suggests that social media is a little bit different for technology brands than other types of brands, but what could people do to sort of bring up social, and how might you suggest that they work differently than other industries based on what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say there's something different per se for tech companies versus other companies when it comes to social. But I think we can say safely that the expectations are much higher, especially when you're talking about consumer tech. The stakes are higher for companies to do well on social, to put out social content that's really editorially driven and is really telling a story. I'm thinking back kind of on what Sean was talking about previously about how regionally speaking, the reporter appetite for tech is kind of constrained to the West Coast. But when we look at kind of social media appetite, audience appetite for that information by doing a social media analysis of how that news is spread, geographically, we don't see any difference. We kind of see this spread across the country. And that tells us that, while the reporter interest is kind of localized, if you will, to where those headquarters are on the West Coast, the appetite for consumer tech in particular on social doesn't have geographic bounds, right? And I think that is one thing that that is worth calling out when it comes to how technology companies engage and use social to tell stories.
Great. So let's look at the timing of some of the social stuff.
Yeah, so a little bit of an eye chart. We tried to, of course, highlight a few of the more important data sets here. And this is, again, not an analysis of the most popular times or when the social media engagement most occurs. This is really the most effective times and days to release your news in order to garner the social media engagement. Again, so this is not most popular times or not when most social media engagement occurs. This is comparing the total amount of social media engagement by the number of releases released at that day and time. Okay, so really what we're seeing here is technology news that goes out early in the morning, then lunchtime, then again later in the evening, tend to generate the best social media engagement. I think the general thinking here is that, people who are following technology news may have more time to discover and consider the news and share it prior to the start of the workday, during the lunch break, then following the workday during commute time and after hours. However, it's interesting, those trends are very consistent, by the way, with the general cross-industry trends. What's unique to technology is this last point that was just revealed here, which is that technology news issued as late as 10 o'clock p.m. and 11 o'clock p.m. actually is when you're going to generate the strongest social media engagement. And that's not the case for cross-industry releases overall, right? So there's a few things here that are very unique to technology, and I mentioned it earlier in the webinar. Issuing releases at 2 a.m. actually generate an above average amount of social media engagement. And then also issuing releases at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock p.m. are also averaging, some of the highest social media engagement. So you see some of the conventional thinking represented here. Yeah, lunchtime, right after work during the commuting hours, but 2 a.m. and then again as late as 11 p.m. are some of the most effective times to release your news to get the social engagement.
So we've got a couple of questions about Twitter, and I'm not sure that you know the answers to these, but I will ask them anyway. So one question was, are the tweets active or passive, meaning are they originated by the agency or the company, or are they coming from third parties? And then related are these tweets by journalists and media? So do you know the distribution of who's doing okay, so can you shed some light on that?
It's a really good question, actually. The easiest way to think about it is all Twitter handles, whether it be the brand, the agency, journalists, consumers, any engagement from all Twitter handles are represented in the counts here. So any, like, share, comment, retweet would be considered an engagement. We count that here. from any and all handles. Now, what I will say is the percentage of Twitter engagements that the brand or the agency will represent in this case is going to be very, very low compared to the total volume of social media engagements, right? When you think about it, the brand maybe just retweets the release once, right? The agency might do 1 or 2 retweets around it, right? Right? I mean, you're talking single digit number of engagements between the brand and the agency here likely, right? The bulk, you know, almost all of the additional engagements are coming from journalists and consumers in this case. So we count it all, but you know, it's always going to be outsized percentage that comes from, you know, that's not controlled. It's truly organic and earned.
So Brian, when you think about social media, and I want you to sort of compare your experience as a journalist versus, you know, the data guy that you are now. What was your relationship with social media as a journalist, and what advice do you give your clients with regard to social based on your experience as a journalist in social media?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, actually, when I was a staff writer and editor at Wired magazine, I was responsible for running their social channels, for coming up with a strategy, making sure storylines were in place, making sure you're promoting the right content at the right time. And it's interesting. This was, you know, back in 2009, 2010, like that type of time frame. So right as kind of Twitter was coming into its own. But before paid social really even existed or was used, it was all organic back then. You know, of course, now there's all these great tools that kind of analyze your social media performance by day and time, but we didn't have any of that, you know, so we kind of just had to create spreadsheets and do some A/B testing to kind of figure these things out. But, you know, long story short, we did a similar analysis like this in terms of audience appetite. You know, when do we get the most engagement on the tweets where we're sharing news out from wired.com, right? And, you know, what we did was like, after we benchmarked and figured out, okay, this is the type of traffic we're driving to the website from social, you know, we set out on a series of experiments on how do we improve this? How do we make it better? And, you know, Twitter being this ephemeral thing where, you know, somebody puts something out once and then it kind of just drops off, right? Like the engagement on that drops off exponentially. The click-throughs on that drop off exponentially. We were thinking of ways on how could we improve that performance? How could we give these social media posts a little bit more staying power? And, you know, one simple trick we did was whatever time we posted the tweet, right, during the day, we would schedule it to rerun again 12 hours later. And so similar to what Sean's seeing here in terms of, you know, release appetite, we were seeing the same thing on our general post as well. You'd see kind of very strong engagement when you first put the tweet out. And like I said, it falls off pretty quickly. But we would see almost identical engagement, that same similar curve when we, you know, put these out 12 hours later. And we weren't sure what was going to happen during this experiment, right? Where people were just going to call us out and be like, why are you posting the same thing twice? But what we found is it basically double our engagement, double our traffic to the site, you know, for the traffic that's coming from social. We can double that just through this simple trick of scheduling things 12 hours apart. So for organic social, I still think that that holds, but with paid social, like that opens up, you know, a lot of different avenues. But with paid, we've kind of become accustomed to seeing the same social post more than once, right? And so I think the strategy still holds. Yeah, you're going to get kind of a fringe amount of people, a fringe group that's saying doesn't want to see that information twice, but you have a real power and ability to influence that. By just creating a social media strategy that is thinking beyond your region and thinking globally.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I think this has been a great webinar. We've actually hit our 45 minutes. It's gone by so incredibly fast. So I want to give each one of you an opportunity to just provide a takeaway for the people who are on this webinar. So Sean, before I turn it over to you, I want to address one of the questions, which is the research based on North America or global? And this is global data, and it is not US data. But Sean, you know, in the last, you know, sort of 30 seconds, you know, what's your takeaway about the data?
Yep, I'm sort of reiterating some concepts I've already touched on. I'd say, just from a best practices perspective, again, don't fall into the trap of your own, jargon as it relates to the communications message itself. And then in terms of, deciding, what's the most effective strategy, be ready to challenge your assumptions and be ready to be a little bit more open-minded about changing, some of the mechanics around when and how you release your news. The stories and the data, we've got a lot of it here. You'll be surprised some of the unexpected insights, that will also reveal, unique opportunities for you to potentially exploit before others do, because there might be uncontested times and days of the week where you can, garner better coverage and social media engagement.
Sean, thank you. Brian, what's your sort of thoughts, takeaways that you might want to offer the audience?
Yeah, I would say that when it comes to kind of technology communications, you can be tempted to do more of the same, right? Kind of repeat what has been successful for other companies. But I think what we're seeing is that really being more precise with your communications and really tailoring the storyline, telling people what's different, that's going to help you make waves in this sea of coverage that exists.
I want to thank both of you. Really, really appreciate the time. I cannot believe how fast 45 minutes went. So thank you so much. I think there was a lot of information and I appreciate all of the questions from the audience. So thank you. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but hopefully we got to most of them. So thank you again. Have a great day.